Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa Price, welcome to Base Podcast. I always start off by determining someone's base credentials, and your base credentials are about as high. They're maxing out, they're redlining at the moment. So you are indeed based, and this is the time. And I was just reflecting on what would it have been, 18 months, 2 years ago, when you came, when you were a councillor.
Yes.
Deputy Mayor. You're Deputy Mayor, and you came here to tell a story about what was really going on in the communities, and you brought Sharon Long, and you spoke to a group of parliamentarians, and then Cole Flint went into the chamber because the media didn't turn up. They didn't want to hear it. They didn't have ears.
No.
You had the voice. They didn't have the ears.
Exactly.
And then the plug got pulled. The ABC pulled the. We're having technical problems. We can't get. So it was a real insight. I was actually quite stunned. Nothing ever happened, of course. But welcome, The Voice. Have you heard about it?
It's a TV show.
It is a TV show. But in political terms, what is it? What does it mean?
Well, it's a whole lot of unknown, really. It's an amendment to our constitution of an entity that has absolutely no detail, that we're told, that it's like being given a colouring in book without the colours in it. Vote for this first, accept this first, everything will be coloured in afterwards, and we'll know what it all means after the fact. So it's a very dangerous concept because it's effectively changing our constitution. Yeah.
An entirely new chapter in the Constitution. This is not like a full stop. A whole new chapter in there with these broad powers to give power to speak to the executive, speak to Parliament. Is it the case that Aboriginal people all want this, or is that a myth?
That's an absolute myth. It's actually a racial stereotype that the Labor government have been pushing to suggest that somehow as a group of Australians, we all think the same, and we have been asked by Indigenous Australians on behalf of all Indigenous Australians to suggest that this is something all Indigenous Australians want. We don't treat any other group of Australians in this way. I mean, we don't gather a group of white Australians together to determine outcomes for white Australia. And then suggest that they then speak on behalf of all of white Australia. No, we treat people as individuals in their own right. And this conversation, this debate, and certainly what Prime Minister Albanese is pushing on the Australian people suggests otherwise. And a lot of Aboriginal Australians are now coming out to say, we don't support this, we haven't been consulted on this, we don't even know what the detail is. We don't know what this means, and we don't trust this government.
Yeah. And do you think is the divisive nature of this resonating through Aboriginal communities as well? I mean, there's this sort of myth, and I remember, my dad, when he came to this country, just wanted to be an Aussie. And I think everyone's like that. We all just want to be that. And the Labor government here keep talking about we've got to unify, but we keep saying, well, we are. Like, what do you mean? So is that the main reason? For me, that's the main reason to vote no, is the division. But there's a whole host of others as well. What is it for you?
Yeah, look, that is the first and foremost for me. It's the principle of dividing us along the lines of race, because it just simply doesn't work. I mean, I've got an Aboriginal mother and a white Australian father. There will be a line going through my family. I've got a husband who's a recent Australian, originally from Scotland. Our blended family with our 4 boys, the 3 that I gave birth to, and my youngest, the stepson, they all have very mixed heritage between them. But ultimately, my 3 can call themselves Warlpiri, can call themselves Aboriginal. My stepson can't. And then my 3 would then have the opportunity to have an extra say about laws that govern our nation because of their heritage. And my stepson can't. This is dividing Australians across the board, and it's dividing Aboriginal Australians, right down the middle. As I said, there's a lot of Aboriginal Australians who don't trust the government and their proposal. They don't trust that the elite, middle-class Aboriginal Australians that are pushing for this transfer of power to enshrine an entity that they believe they won't get a say in because they've been disregarded, that they've been ignored by that elite few for so long now. They don't believe that this voice mechanism is about propel them into having the opportunity to be heard.
And so what are the problems? There are lots of problems in remote communities. What do they look like? I mean, you're Alice Springs resident, and been there for your entire life, I think. And so you've watched it on the ground. Is it worse now than it's been for a while? And what are the things you're seeing on the ground?
Yeah, look, things have got particularly bad more recently with the fact that I think our kids aren't being looked after properly. We're seeing kids on the street late at night. Indigenous kids in remote communities in particular experience the highest rates of domestic family violence, sexual abuse. And, myself and our leader, Peter, have called for a royal commission into the sexual abuse of Indigenous kids. And the Labor government don't want a bar of it, yet the statistics are screaming that we need this to happen. That's a step that we can be taking right now, and to actually give those kids a voice in all of this to be heard. Yeah. Myself, our colleague, Senator Karen Little, we've had 2 motions on the floor of the Senate to launch inquiries into land councils, statutory authorities, Aboriginal organisations that have funded billions of dollars to produce outcomes that will improve the lives of our most marginalised. They are responsible as well. This is the industry that currently exists that either needs fixing or in parts requires dismantling. And that's the hard work that we have to do that hasn't been done.
Yeah, because that's actually hard work. Like the solutions there are hard and they require, serious decision making. This and taking your point about the decision, the detail, we don't really know what it does, but this, the voice, what it would do to our constitution and ultimately to Aboriginal communities. Would that add any value, do you think, in your mind? I mean, does it help those sort of things, or does it make it worse, or is it largely the same?
Well, let's look at this. So we've got an entity known as SNAKE, which is the lead national advocacy body for Indigenous children, who downplay the rates of sexual abuse amongst Indigenous kids, effectively sweeping it under the rug. I mean, if that peak national body is in denial of the facts and of the evidence and refuse to accept that we need to do something more drastic to ensure that our kids aren't experiencing such high rates of sexual abuse in our country, I have no trust at all, no confidence that a voice to Parliament is supposed to provide all the solutions. And it's assuming that Aboriginal people somehow know how to fix the problems of Aboriginal people. We're all people, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It doesn't come down to race. Yeah.
It always struck me that Aussies would work this out. I mean, apart from the fact that we're flying in the face of 100 years plus of referenda not getting up. 44, I think there have been, and 8 have only been successful. So it's a big ask. But I always thought Aussies would work this out, and it feels like, particularly over the last 2 or 3 weeks, I mean, you've been doing a lot of work. You've been, out every night talking to people across the country. And are you sensing that the penny's dropping and people are saying, no, wait a minute, we don't want that? I mean, is it growing on and that's obviously a good thing from where we sit. But
yeah, look, absolutely. And I think, the Yes campaign have been up in arms because our slogan is, if you don't know, vote no. But that comes down to the fact that when you do go to find out, to be informed on the matter, you're no better informed than what you were when you started out, because Prime Minister Albanese has not provided any more detail, because it's all to be written after the fact. And Australians don't like that. Australians don't like to be kept in the dark, have the wool pulled over their eyes. They like to be well informed. And so when they go to seek information, they are actually more likely to vote no. And that's what's happening.
So let's step through this for people that might not be 100% across the process. This Parliament, the government here, the Albanese government, introduced a bill seeking a referendum. That referendum bill proposed some words for the referendum question that goes to the people. We opposed it. Our side of Parliament opposed it. It got passed, notwithstanding. And the referendum is effectively like a mini election, we could say. It's a vote of the whole country. You need a double majority. You need a majority of people in the country, and you need a majority of the majority of states, which sounds a bit weird, but you need a lot of people. It's hard to pass.
Yes.
So you would think normally that people would be very cautious with that sort of approach, but we're seeing now a real drifting. Do you think that what we're seeing now is a product of people starting to understand that this is going to create potentially more bureaucracy, more red tape. I mean, what we see, because we see a bit of that detail, is the fact that we're going to get a big Canberra voice. And you've been calling it the Canberra voice. What do you mean by that?
Well, even if you look at the so the Uluru Statement from the Heart, in the 25 pages that sit behind it, that we've been all gaslit about, that aren't part of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. But if you look to those pages, it provides the detail as to what the proponents of the voice are seeking through this.
Yeah.
And they've even stated that they would expect for space in Parliament House itself, offices for the voice, sort of almost like a third chamber within Parliament. The word Black Parliament has been used. And of course, this is the problem. So there, when you go looking for the detail, and the Prime Minister's denying it, but then you see the work of the referendum working group in their own words. This is what we're sort of cautioning Australians against supporting, and what the consequences actually look like, especially when no real guardrails have been put in place, no determination. I mean, the Prime Minister calls it an advisory body, but nowhere within the question being put to the Australian people or the brand new chapter itself is the word advice, advise or advisory even stipulated. And that there is red flags when the Prime Minister says one thing, but in actual fact, the question and the chapter say something completely different.
Yeah. And there actually are already bodies that do this. There's the NIAA, the National Indigenous Australians Agency, which has got, I think, a $2 billion per annum, $4 billion per annum budget. And so this is, presumably be slightly different, but it'd be pretty similar as well, except that it's bricked into the Constitution. So what people need to understand when they're thinking about their vote is that this is not something, if we, as we think, it's a bad thing, it's not easy to unpick. You've got to go back to another referendum to fix it. So it's pretty risky, right? Like this is a serious undertaking.
It is a very serious undertaking, and I think, through Senate estimates and the audit process, it's been demonstrated that the NIAA aren't actually meeting their requirements in terms of, ensuring that funding is that it's not being provided to an opportunist or being misspent, or exactly how funding is being provided to various different programs. And we need to look closely at whether it is in fact delivering on what it's supposed to be delivering or not, because it's questionable at the minute, whether that is the case. So, and that's the case for a lot of, entities, which is why we're seeking an inquiry. But then if that's the case with so many, and we've got over 3,000 of these bodies, why would we create a brand new one with the likelihood of it failing? And because we've been told also by the proponents of the voice that, look, it won't work right away, but it can be reworked. Why would we put that in our Constitution when we know that there's a great likelihood of failure to begin with, because we've got so many models before it that have failed? Why would we do that? Why would we put our Constitution at risk in that way?
Antic, another one that people forget. It wasn't that long ago.
Absolutely. Antic, it was a bipartisan decision by the Howard government at the time, with the Latham-led Labor opposition, to dismantle Antic. It was embroiled in allegations of corruption, misuse of funds, sexual misconduct, those sorts of allegations, and it wasn't doing what it was supposed to do in terms of supporting Indigenous Australians. So that it was termed a failed experiment. So why would we try yet another experiment?
And of course, in that case, it was legislative, so it just takes an act of Parliament. Easy.
Exactly.
Not so much here. It's actually been quite a learning curve for all of us, I think, in the sense that there are all these new words. Makarata is one that gets bandied around a lot. People are going to hear that a lot probably in the next 6 weeks or so, and it, I think, is misused by this Labor government a little bit. What does it mean? What does it mean to people on the ground? Aboriginal people.
Yeah. So the term Makarata is a Yolngu term. word, which actually is a meaning for payback, for cultural payback. It's literally a spearing in the leg, to be done to someone who's, seen to have done the wrong thing, to maim them so they can no longer function appropriately to, hunt for themselves and look after themselves in that way. But what gets me is that, yes, this has been used, but who are the proponents of the voice suggesting should be on the receiving end of Makarata? Like...
Not me, thanks.
No, exactly. There's not an Australian alive today that is responsible for what occurred in our nation's history.
Yeah.
And certainly those of us Indigenous Australians, today, what occurred back then, really, we've got a different Australia. We're living in a completely different Australia where there's plenty of opportunities for us.
Yeah. And I'm seeing, and I think I'm seeing this, and maybe I'm imagining it, but I'm seeing through the left now in politics generally this worrying trend of taking quite radical revolutionary concepts and laws and trying to sweep them under the rug quickly so that nobody can see. We've seen examples of that in South Australia with some social policy stuff that's come up in the last 2 or 3 years. But it feels like this here is a bit like that. I mean, back at Federation and before, in 1891, they spent almost a decade talking about the Constitution. Admittedly, more volume, but this is still a whole chapter. And the transcripts were circulated. People talked about them. They sent their representatives and they debated and they argued. And yet here, this government is just saying, "Trust us, it's going to be all right. Trust me, I'm from the government."
Exactly.
I mean, it strikes me as being bizarre. And do you think this is, is it as bold as that? Is it? And if so, why?
Yeah. Look. There wasn't a constitutional convention, and that's obviously deliberate because even with the Uluru Convention that they held and those dialogues, they were invite-only individuals. So even the Indigenous... I didn't get an invite.
I didn't get an invite either.
I certainly didn't get an invite, and there was a purpose to that because it was the proponents of the voice pushing their particular agenda. That's what they wanted to achieve is the final outcome. And the name Uluru was used and exploited for this PR campaign. The majority of traditional owners at Uluru don't support this. And I've had conversations with them and they're upset that they have been exploited for the purpose of this. But going to your point about states using laws and sweeping them under the rug and pushing them through, well, look at Western Australia with the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act, which has now had to be scrapped because it's failed. And it's really angered a lot of Western Australians. Look at what's happening in Victoria with the Truth-Telling Commission.
Yeah.
I mean, in their eyes, truth-telling is about, well, how can we maximise our benefits, really? Saying, look, we're aggrieved, so therefore we're owed something, this is what we want. And they want to set up complete separate laws around child protection, treating Indigenous kids completely different when they are Australian citizens.
Yeah.
Having a lowered standard for those kids, blaming racism and colonisation for the high rates of removal, and yet ignoring the fact that Indigenous children in Victoria, 19 out of every 1,000 kids who have had a report brought against their care that has been substantiated in terms of child protection, but that is not brought up. That is not brought up. All those key elements as to why the kids are being removed is never actually part of the conversations, but they're asking for separate laws.
Yeah, and then back to the original point, the voice of division, we say. You've said a couple of times here, Canberra doesn't need a voice, it needs ears, and I have shamelessly used that wherever I go as well. Not our bills, by the way. They're green, not red. By that you mean that Canberra's not listening at the moment. There's a lot of talk about it, but you seem to be, you and Karen Little and others, I mean, people that are familiar with the communities that are not Aboriginal people keep talking about the problems that exist, and they don't seem to be listening to that. They don't seem to be talking about that. We have the cashless debit card, which got quashed in the early stages of this government. Is that what it is? Canberra needs to just listen?
Canberra needs ears, not a voice. And again, the latest claim from the proponents of the voice, Megan Davis, is suggesting that this will be about giving women and girls an equal say. Well, women were screaming out for the cashless debit card to be maintained.
And just tell people what that did for those that don't know.
So it quarantined a percentage of of people's welfare payments, so that they could only have a certain amount available in cash. The rest was on their cards. And for vulnerable women, Aboriginal Australians, we have a demand share economy where anything that you own, your family can demand that of you. Right. And when you're dealing with people who are suffering from substance abuse, you're culturally not supposed to say no. So your family member can say, hey, give me your wage. I want it for my addiction. And you are not allowed to say no. So it was protecting vulnerable women, the elderly, and making sure that kids had food in their bellies. And this government, for ideological reasons, because they were listening to academics and elites in the city, decided to scrap it. And all hell has broken loose in many of those communities where it was protecting vulnerable people.
Yeah, and it struck me as weird the whole way along that you do have people like yourself who've lived in that environment who are not being listened to. That's the whole point of not having ears. We say it all the time in the chamber behind there's the voice here. You're not listening to it. Jacinta's here, and it seems to just sort of be ideological for this government. But I mean, look, we'll see what happens on the 14th of October. We're very hopeful it'll go down. Just about your own. I think it's a fascinating story. Your mum was in politics originally. She was a councillor, and she was the mayor, I think, of.
No, I was deputy mayor. My mother was a minister in the CLP.
Sorry, ultimately a minister in the CLP. Yeah. So there's a pedigree of politics in the family. But did that? I mean, that sort of shaped where you got up to now. I mean, like, how did you get interested in? And being here.
Oh, look, I think as a family, we were very frustrated in understanding what the real issues were on the ground, what the real impacts were that were, ingraining sort of this disadvantage for Aboriginal people and violence and acceptance of violence in our culture. So we advocated for the reduction of violence within our communities. The starting point being, this is because it's culturally ingrained. Within our traditional culture, we've got payback, Makarata. Women are second-class citizens to men. Young girls could be married off in arranged marriages, and my mother was supposed to be at the age of 13 married off. And because of our positions, and we wanted to be very honest, it sort of led us on a path to my mother being elected after being appointed by actually Marion Scrimgeour, who was the Deputy Chief Minister of the Territory for the Labor Henderson government. My mother was appointed as the chairperson of the Indigenous Advisory for the Henderson government, but felt in that position that was a token group, so to make the Henderson government look like they were listening to Aboriginal voices. So she went, I'll put my hand up myself and I'll run. And that's why she got into politics. And then I thought I need to get to federal parliament because that's where I've been needed the most.
Yeah, well, we're very glad you're here and you're doing an amazing job. I mean, people cannot possibly understand how much work you're doing to defeat this, and it's going to be a very important run. And just to touch on Colin, who's a great bloke, your husband, he's a Melbourne supporter, which is not, he can't have everything, but that's okay. But he must be, sort of basically holding the house up at the moment. I mean, you're just sort of away all the time. And how's he going with the travel?
Well, yeah, that poor thing. I'm dragging him around the country at times, but otherwise he's going to be playing in Nashville fairly soon. So he gets to take some time out over in Nashville, which I'd love to preferably be over there. But we've got a referendum to take down. But look, no, he's been an incredible support. I'm very grateful for the fact that he's because he's got a bit of a he's known around the country for his music, and it's difficult to be an artist in this woke culture and to have a position on anything and to support Jacinta Price as his wife. So he's had a target on his back as well. But I'm very grateful that he certainly supported me throughout all this and continues to.
Yeah, well, we're very lucky to have you both on the case. So.
Can I just make one correction? I know I provided a statistic before. I said 19 out of 1,000. It was 91 For Indigenous children, it's 91 every 1,000 who are reported to child protection substantiated claims.
Good one. Let the record show that's been duly corrected.
Yes.
Notwithstanding all of that, thanks again. And, it's great to have you here and doing all the great work and around the country. And thanks for everything. Truly a anointed member of the Base podcast. Thank you for having a chat. And we'll see you in Adelaide soon.
Yes.
Looking forward to it.
Absolutely.
See you then.
Authorised by Antic, Liberal Party of Australia, Adelaide.